Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is particularly tumultuous these last 24 hours and for the months to come for sure. It's a planet still wrapped in a pandemic and absolutely facing an information extreme storm with huge amounts of disinformation flowing from Moscow these days. I was looking at Pravda front page last night, and there was Trump talking about Putin's genius on the front page, the homepage of Pravda. And the attack started. And as you all know, normally I talk about pandemic resilience and climate resilience and energy progress, but I also have done sessions on here on this Sustain Wet webcast on turbulence in society and how we can work things better or not, depending on largely on foresight, but on making knowledge actionable and on figuring out how to disentangle conflicts when they start. So I've got two great guests here today, Sharon Burke and Rod Schoonover. You'll learn more about what they're doing in a second. We're looking here from Twitter just a couple hours ago at protests in Moscow, saying, so there's some people who are not being fed the party line, literally. And we'll see how that domestic pressure situation plays out. Alejandro Alvarez is a journalist on Twitter who's been throwing together the best, sort of most reliable list I've seen so far of live video or recent video of some of the situations that are unfolding, both the attacks by the Russians and the situation on the ground. But let's get to my guests. Again, it's great that you're both able to break away from the work that you do. And we'll start with Sharon. You've had a really interesting career, including as an assistant Secretary of Defense for energy. It was a new position, right? Energy performance within the Department of Defense, but many other things. Can you give a thumbnail sketch of how you became who you are so far and what you're doing?
If that is a thumbnail. I've always been interested in natural resources and in the security angle of that. And so I've worked on sort of that combination of national security and natural resources most of my career. I started, believe it or not, these many years ago at the Office of Technology Assessment, which was this great congressional agency that got eliminated, right?
Tell youngins what it was and why it mattered.
So it was the U.S. Office of Technology Assessment, and it was a direct research agency of Congress, and it looked at science and technology and engineering issues and gave Congress advice on how to legislate. So, for example, all these internet issues we're having, there was a whole agency that existed to help them understand what the nature of the challenges were and how to write good laws. But it got eliminated by Newt Gingrich in 1994 to sort of prove that we could do with a smaller government. So it was a great organization while it lasted, and it had programs in national defense, in transportation, and then I worked in the energy and materials program there at the beginning of my career. So where we were looking at things like energy needs in developing countries and whether or not there was a different path that developing economies could take to develop their energy resources. That was a long time ago, but that question is just as sort of viscerally important now as it was when we were writing those reports. So it's too bad that it went away, but it certainly cast the die for me as far as what I was going to be interested in. But a lot of my career has been at the Pentagon or the State Department, working on either national defense issues or energy and climate change related issues.
Yeah, and some of these issues suddenly get pushed right to the very far background when war breaks out, which is always interesting. I was a climate and environment reporter, but I became a 9/11 reporter for 2 years after that horrific moment. And this idea of balancing conflict and these sort of more systemic risks. Climate change has these eruptions too, which are more about vulnerability often than about that slow change in the system. Does that frustrate you, or how do you tell people in the climate realm, hey, that isn't the only thing that matters?
Well, I think one of the things I'm really interested in looking at is like directly germane to what's happening right now, which is, why do nations go to war? And
Right.
if you look just really superficially, right, not so superficial is the wrong word, but if you look at what's right in front of us right now, this looks like President Putin making a choice about power and about money. But energy and the resource situation in his country and in Ukraine are intimately woven in to
Right.
the realities and the situation and the frictions that are happening there. So what I'm really interested in is the ways in which climate change, energy, critical minerals, water, all of these things are part of that fabric of stability or instability. And I think the more we understand that, the better we understand why countries go to war, and also the better we understand how to build peace. And we have so many better tools now to start pulling apart some of these strands and understanding how this all fits together. So to me, it actually is all of a piece that,
Right.
even though right now our focus is on, the armed conflict that's unfolding, if we're gonna at some point we got to figure out how to fix the situation, bring it back to a peaceful stability situation. How do you do that, and what
Yeah.
role does energy play in it is a really important question.
Yeah, I want to dig in on that energy question in a few minutes, particularly in the context of gas. You could make the argument that there's no quick way for America to suddenly send vast amounts of gas to the parts of Europe that need it. But energy abundance, the transition here from energy shortages and from importing natural gas to being the world's top producer, and I think this year for LNG, we're like the top exporter of LNG. It seems to change at least the toolkit that you can play with.
Yes and no. I mean, as you
Well,
said in your question, you know very well that one of the problems is that we don't have nationalized energy industries the way that Russia does. So
right.
Russia can command its oil and gas industry and say you will, you won't. Whereas it's a little more complicated here because it's
For
private
sure.
ownership. But I'm sure that's the meat of what you want to get into today.
Yeah. What can we do? And then how much of it's about the energy transition too? So, Rod, you have
Yeah.
a new gig. As you've been on here a number of
Mhm.
times, and you now are here at this the Council on Strategic Risk. And this report,
Mhm.
I can't remember if we mentioned you were on to talk about this. I think you did mention this. So just give us
I
your thumbnail for those who haven't met you before. Very
Sure.
interesting career, starting in science, getting in at intelligence, and here you are.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm Rod Schoonover. I'm glad to be back. I'm a physicist by training. My first career was as an academic, and I was a professor out in San Luis Obispo, California, for a number of years. Joined the Obama administration in the intelligence community to work on climate change and environmental change and ecological change as inputs to national security and foreign policy issues. And I left government in 2019 and has since, as you mentioned, joined the Council on Strategic Risks as the head of the Ecological Security Program.
And you're
And so,
teaching at Georgetown.
yeah, I teach two classes. One is climate science to non-majors, and also a new class called Introduction to Ecological Security. And just off the bat, I want to this is a dreadful day. This is I worked at the State Department, and even before that, I worked with the Department of Defense while I was still an academic, and I would go over, on scientific audit teams to Ukraine and Russia. I've spent many, many weeks in both of those countries, including, where a lot of this action is happening. I was in a hotel in Kiev, flipping back and forth between Russia and Ukrainian TV as the tanks were entering North Ossetia in Georgia. And the prospect of this happening to Ukraine seemed at the time remote. And now here we are. We saw the invasion of Crimea.
Yeah.
And now we see the full invasion of Ukraine. And, this is quite serious. And it's, I think it's a very painful thing for me to watch unfold, because not only do I love Ukraine so much, I actually love Russia very much. I think the government does not, I think especially right now, is not really representative of the Russian people. I can't imagine people waking up, especially far away from Moscow, thrilled that the Kremlin has opened up an invasion of many of their relatives. Yeah. And so I think this is a tragic mistake, and we'll be feeling the implications of for, who knows, decades.
Yeah. It's
great
so hard to know.
About.
Yeah. And it's the kind of thing, once you start it, you both are aware of this phenomenon where things spin out in ways that, even if you're a master of three-dimensional chess, you probably, even if you're Putin, you probably may not anticipate each one of the outcomes. Complexity sucks.
Right.
It seems so simple in some ways.
And so Sharon was mentioning earlier, and I think some really good points about how embedded these other issues, resource issues, energy issues. I also think we have to consider the effect that the pandemic has had on this. If you believe the media reports, not just on how it's torquing societies, because what we're doing to combat the pandemic are fairly unnatural to how human systems have evolved. And also, if you believe the media reports, Putin himself had kind of bunkered himself up, and it's probably more isolated than he has been in the past. And that isolation may work out to be a serious miscalculation. But we'll see. Everything is so fluid right now.
And Sharon, over to you.
I was just going to say, I agree with Rod in the ways that the pandemic has weakened economies and societies is, I think, pervasive. And it really worries me that this is not the last kind of break that we're going to see, that right now the global economy and the global polity really is very weak because of this. This has been a major shock. So, and I think with Russia, with a place like Russia too, we don't really know the full details of how this has affected them, because they have not been transparent at all about their infection rates and their death rates or anything else. So we don't even know how severe the effects have been there and what role it might have been playing up till now. But that's certainly one of the allegations, is that his domestic position is so weak that's part of what's going on here. I'm not a Russia expert. I don't know, but that's certainly one of the storylines that people are talking about.
So, Rod, if you were like in one of these meetings at the White House, and there are these various lenses on what's happening right now, obviously you're not there, but if you think of a situation like this, who's out there assessing how much of this is the pandemic and its personal effects on the isolation of Putin, how much of it's about some strategic analysis Russia made of the value of going in, et cetera, et cetera? How does that get sifted, parsed? Well, can you
I'll just tell you, I know the people at the CIA who would be making these kinds of analyses, and I would be surprised if they had not factored the pandemic into their intelligence assessments of what has turned out to be a crucially important question of the last few months. So, but on the operational side, it's actions, right? It's actions that matter ultimately.
And that's probably where their focus right now is, on operations and on allies and on the diplomacy angle. The sort of root cause discussion is probably not on the table at the moment.
But Right. What are the responses that are necessary, and what are the outcomes from those? And I guess that leads to these questions about energy and sanctions. And it feels awfully constraining to see a headline that we're now ratcheting up the sanctions more. It's a response to a brute move of a chess piece like this that's knocking over everything and killing people. But it's the only tool in the toolbox, I guess. That seems like a very bizarre situation.
This is so different because, of course, we're facing a nuclear armed country that still has a very, very large arsenal. So, I mean, that's what
Right.
this is about. And Putin's been using that as sort of an inversion of the deterrence principle for some time now, where he's been pushing the line and pushing the line and pushing the line. And it's very difficult to retaliate when you don't want to escalate. So the sanctions, I think that the administration, there's a lot they can do. I mean, this is a country that's very corrupt. So it comes down to like, what's the price elasticity of corruption, right? And so sanctions sanctions are a blunt weapon for sure, and one that hits the population as much as anything else. But when you have a country that's so corrupt and so disproportionately dependent on mineral resources, you can target more in a more direct way the people that are getting the income. So especially, I think one of the things you have to compliment the Biden administration for is that sanctions may not sound very glamorous, may not sound as good as we went in there with tanks and combat aircraft, but these are weapons too, and they have to be fought with other countries. And this is some pretty adroit diplomacy you're seeing. So far, even it sounds like China might be taking a step back, which I think Putin certainly counted on given his appearance at the Olympics. So at the end of the day, there's more ways than one to handle a security situation than at the barrel gun. And right now, the Biden administration is demonstrating what that looks like. You have your military force at the ready because it has to be part of the equation, but they're very effectively using international consensus, diplomacy, and economic tools to bring pressure to bear.
Right. And I was in the intelligence community reading classified cables during several waves of sanctions, and they did hurt. And on the other hand, I think we probably, on a scale of 1 to 10, those early sanctions were probably a 2 or a 3. I expect the set that were announced today to be a lot more harmful and disruptive. We're not in the same situation as we were with Crimea. We are now on the other side of information warfare against the United States that started somewhere around 2014, 15, and has continued. We are, the economic sanctions, I think, have to be a part of it. But there's also a third element. Sanctions are not the only tool, and I would mention information warfare that the Biden administration has conducted. I think it's fair to even say that has been remarkably effective. And so the fact, and giant congratulations to my former colleagues in the intelligence community in the effective use of declassified information to let the entire world know what was going on ahead of time. And would that have that doesn't necessarily affect the ultimate outcome, but it helps the rest of the community really realize what's happening. And then just a second part, I expect cyber operations to be conducted against Russia. We would not typically do that in an overt manner, but I think the whole-scale invasion of Ukraine changes the whole dynamic. So the world has not really seen what the United States can do with its cyber offensive capabilities.
We'll see. I would say one thing, I know that the products I use, I got a note yesterday about a patch. If you're getting information from Microsoft or Apple that you need to put in a new patch, a new security update, do it right away. Because this is definitely in play. This is going to be part of this. It already is. The overt part, which Rod was talking about, the way messages are being put out there and the way that the Biden administration is putting out intelligence in the open in an unprecedented way. And Rod, I'm curious what you think about that, because I know the intelligence community has generally mixed feelings about putting so much classified information in the street, largely because once you show where you're getting information, you don't get it anymore. I mean, how do you feel about that? Are you hearing from your colleagues or?
I'm not hearing from my colleagues on that but as someone who has seen sources burned and people, imprisoned for that particular role, desperate times require desperate actions, and so I think I think this administration has been doing it in a strategic way, and that certainly they have been weighing the costs versus the benefits. But this is probably one of the more formative actions that will shape international relations for decades. And so it's against that metric, I think. Yeah, it was probably the right move.
I just was reading the other day. I've become friends with a professor at URI. She's a professor of propaganda literacy, Renee Hobbs. She's really cool. She has a whole curriculum on that. She's been on the show too. But her field, the people talking about public health communication, and I'm blanking on the phrase, but it's like you can inoculate people ahead of time before misinformation, which it sounds like you're talking about that's what's happening. What happened with this,
right?
This bolus of fact,
right,
ahead of time to kind of create a cognitive landscape that's more doubtful of the misinformation.
Well, and it's funny watching the actions of Putin in the last week, sort of a return to real old school 20th century propaganda, right? It's not algorithmic and swaying people.
No,
it's outright disinformation, and I would even say lies.
Here's Pravda right here.
So
yeah.
It has been since 2014. That's his speech on Monday. I think he was saying it has been since like time immemorial, since ancient. So that's kind of an update.
Unbelievable. And of course
that would be unthinkable, as an unthinkable Pravda headline in 2014, right?
Interesting.
So there has been an evolution, I think, in certainly Vladimir Putin's tenor and possibly viewpoint, considering the entire former Soviet Union. And so it'll be I think it's harrowing. I think it's terrifying. I think it's interesting to see the demonstrations that are popping up in Russia, right? And so we'll see how that how that develops. But I think that's something quite important to take note of. And as you showed that photo, they are not getting their information from state TV. There's a huge percentage of the Russian people who have decoupled.
That's interesting too. Yeah, those phones, all those phones in all those hands. And it's a hard country to wall off in terms of information. Good point.
And all the phones and all the hands everywhere. I mean, it does. Granted, we all are prisoners to our own feeds, but certainly what I'm seeing is there's a big global outcry, and the way that the Twitterverse is reacting to this has been, I think, fascinating. And Putin's definitely losing global opinion, no question about that. And here at home too. Now it's weird. The dynamic at home is just bizarre.
Yes.
Having worked for both Republicans and Democrats in my career, I never thought I would see the current circumstances, but I did notice that Senator Josh Hawley, put out a statement a few hours ago, really strongly condemning Putin's invasion of Ukraine. So it's going to be interesting to see how this develops here at home too. But I certainly hope that it becomes closer to a moment of unity for the American people as well. It should.
Yeah, well,
I consider this moment to be an X-ray on our own politics. How do we condemn this, and who condemns this assault on the international order that the United States helped create? I think
the order,
right. I think the actions and the the actions and the rhetoric should be really judged against this moment. And I don't know if it will be, but I think we're in pretty dangerous times.
I agree.
Watching some of the Fox hosts do what they were doing a day or two ago was just surreal.
And they may be walking some of this back, right? Because I think a lot of people thought that it was bluster. I know a lot of people within Russia, some of the Russian elites, thought that this was all bluster and meant to just show force. And then here you go. I think a lot of these people will probably, well, hopefully, I don't want to read into them, but hopefully they'll wish that they could have walked back those comments.
Yeah, here's a pretty straightforward Fox News website lead story. It doesn't look spun for once. So maybe, we'll see. We'll see how it all plays out, as my dad used to say.
I think in this moment, I just want them to come back to, that we're in a dangerous moment, and there's a lot of people in Ukraine who are really paying the price for, Putin's desire. So at the moment, I just want, very public Republicans and Fox News to do the right thing. We can sort it all out later, but I would welcome them back to saying the right things in this instance, because of just how dangerous the moment is. So we can sort out the wreckage later, but right now it's just good to hear them saying more responsible things about this really terrible, dangerous situation. Ugh.
Can we talk just for a couple of minutes about the get back to energy, mostly energy? Europe clearly has a deep gap that contributed. It's hard to see, it's hard for me to think that there isn't validity to the idea that Putin was liberated in his movements and choices by Europe's dependence on gas and oil to a certain extent. Is there any counter argument? I mean, is it that failure on the part of Europe to have some form of independence, whether it's through a real transition to renewables, whether it was through Germany keeping its nuclear power plants running, whether it's through them getting more gas from other sources? Was that a big contributor here?
I mean, Germany is, of course, the at the crux of it. It's hard not to feel good about Germany making a really strong declaration for climate policy, and that they're going to phase out their coal plants and phase out their nuclear plants. But as a large industrial economy, when they first made those declarations, anybody in the energy world was like, they're running headlong toward a brick wall, because the solar and the wind that they can get, while they've been very aggressive about exploiting those resources, it wasn't going to be enough to replace the baseload power that they were getting, and that transition plan, the runway was too short. So at some point, they kind of obliged themselves to get natural gas. And what are their choices, right? For the scale that they need it, Russia and, Iran. So there weren't good choices there. So definitely, I think that when the Germans made the choice to go ahead with some of these pipelines, I don't think that they thought through the strategic implications as much as they should have. So, but it's kind of hard because on the one hand, I find Germany's commitment to climate action, exciting and laudable, but this is the path they put themselves on, unfortunately.
And I agree with all of that. And the Europeans were in a very difficult situation. But the real question, I think, is eventually the Europeans would turn away from fossil fuels, and the only question is how fast. And so, and the Russians and the pipeline made that slower than it should have been. And the velocity of change is the overriding factor in what kind of future we're going to have. And now, it's a good thing we don't have time machines, because I think the Europeans would really want to jump in one and reassess their energy policy of the 2000s. On the other hand, on the flip side of this, I think the actions of today and going forward speed the Europeans further into more decoupling from Russian liquid, natural gas. And so it's going to perversely have the opposite effect that I think that Russia and Putin was calculating. But we'll see. We'll see how much this day is crafted, the narrative and how the Europeans internalize it. But we'll see.
Yeah. It certainly illustrated that being dependent on hydrocarbons is always going to be a vulnerability, a strategic vulnerability, not just an environmental and a future problem, but also a geostrategic one. It has been for 70 years.
That's right.
This is nothing new. So that continues to be the case. It'll be interesting. I wonder what you both think of this too, though. If the upshot of that is not just that Europe diversifies and moves away from dependence on Russia, but also if it makes Russia even more dependent on China as a customer than it already is. And that's not a great thing either. I don't know what you think of that.
By the way, what I'm showing here is 2014, when there was a big burst of a debate in the United States about gas exports as a way to keep Putin out of Ukraine. That was the first incursion, et cetera. So this issue has come up again recently. I guess the question I'd ask you both is about my climate hawk friends. I've been writing about, as you all know, I've been writing about climate since 1988 for half my life, and I'm Medicare age. And I don't put it in the foreground always. In fact, quite often these days, I think about climate vulnerability reduction. I think about natural gas needs in sub-Saharan Africa for just basic development. I think about energy security or insecurity leading to things like what we're looking at right now. And I think about the ways to soften the path toward a hotter world as not. I don't always think about it with the urgency of some of my friends, even though I've been dug in this issue so long. And I don't know if you feel I'm making a mistake, or it's like, if the train just falls off the tracks completely because we now have a global politic in which you got basically a superpower rogue state, then how do we go to COP27 and think we're going to get something done reasonably?
So in an hour and a half, I'm going to go to Georgetown and teach 20 students, another way that climate change is going to make their life a little bit harder. And, it can't be underestimated how serious climate change is. I think we, especially those of us who talk about it all the time, and we try to be analytic in nature. It's hard to imagine something more fundamentally disruptive to things across the board than the changing temperature of the planet. And so I'm kind of, I think the multilateral actions are critical, right? There's no other. We can't get to where we need to be through market forces. This does not work.
No.
And so, I mean, I don't envy the people at State Department who are thinking about how to approach COP27 as the international landscape is fragmenting, possibly. But the question about nudging Russia closer to China, that's kind of been happening a little bit. They're not historically very good friends, but I think out of necessity, I think some of the sanctions that the United States announced today will drive them right towards Beijing.
Interesting.
But it's a calculated risk, and we needed to respond. We needed to respond in kind. But I think this makes climate policy even more difficult. Now, we should back up. Russia is really quite poor on climate policy and climate action, even though they will almost certainly be quite disrupted by climate effects. But so just in terms of getting Russia to the table, that's always been a challenge. But it's the whole the holistic bringing of countries together, including the United States, saying we need to ratchet down our emissions as quickly as possible. So our levers, especially after the prior administration, broke a lot of those levers that we had in the international system.
I think Russia is a really interesting case in climate change because, as Rod alluded to, so much of their country is permafrost and it's melting. And, the country's built to have solid permafrost. So the fact that it's melting is going to be a huge cost for them. I think they think longer term, we're a net winner in climate change because our country becomes warmer. Right now, so much of it is permafrost. But between here and there, it's going to be devastating for their economy. And then, of course, they're a hydrocarbon-based economy. But here's an interesting wrinkle in it, which is they also are very rich in other kinds of minerals, non-fuel minerals, and the kinds of minerals that you need to actually have an energy transition. So Russia actually could play well in an energy transition in developing a lot of these resources that are necessary for that. I think that's part of here. One of the things that motivates China is that when China looks ahead at the way that climate change is going to affect them, they're going to need more agricultural partners. They're going to need more mineral partners for the transition. And Russia hits a lot of those notes. So I think when you look at it, Russia and China haven't always had an easy partnership, but increasingly they need each other. So I think this has been developing for a long time, but it's not a happy development, particularly, by the way, if they start sharing their military technology, that would definitely not be a good thing. I'm sure it's already happening, but there are certain things that if they begin to share, that is not good for anyone else in the world.
And with China, I'm not sure what's in it for Beijing. I can see what's in it for Moscow, but
I agree with that.
The minerals that you mentioned, are a big part of that factor. But Russia's economy is just a fraction, a small fraction of what China's is. So this is not 1960, right? The dynamics are completely different.
So I have one more like granular question, and then one we'll close out with a big one. The granular one is about Ukraine's actual energy system. They have 15 nuclear power plants, and that must make for an unnerving landscape to wage war on, including for the aggressor. I don't know whether that is something that concerns you right now. I mean, there are many dimensions to this, so it's hard to pick one out. But have you thought about that?
So I have been to Chernobyl twice, and I saw the Russians on their approach to Kyiv, took the town of Chernobyl and the power plant. I'm not so worried about that one as the ones that you're talking about
the
now.
Operating ones, yeah.
Right, the operating ones. And on the other hand, the China, Russia's a nuclear power already. They're not going to gain a lot of technology here. These are Russian nuclear plants. So it's lower on my list of concerns. I think the Russians have the ability to keep these secure. But it also gives them an instrument. When you're in charge of any kind of power plant, you have an instrument of control over the people. That's the part that I would worry about. Because we saw them do this with water, right? During the takeover of Crimea. We saw them try to strangle the Dnieper River. And so there is a history of Russia doing this upon, their encroachments or outright invasions.
My grandfather came from a village along the Dnieper River.
Mm-hmm.
My father's father. So here, and Sharon, do you want to say anything more about sort of this current landscape? What keeps you up at night thinking about what's unfolding?
All of it, to be honest with you, the heartbreaking scenes from Ukraine and what people are living through, and then also what's at stake here, and the fact that this could escalate. Again, I feel like we're already in a fragile, dangerous period in world history, and if we look at 100 years ago, the last time that we came out of a pandemic, the global economy failed, and then we entered another world war. And so the precedent is not encouraging. So to have a major power invade another country like this and have the world standing against them. And, again, China so far has indicated that they support Russia's action. It all keeps me up at night. It's all really worrisome. The nuclear power plants, for sure, just because anytime that you're in a war, that's a target. Any infrastructure that supports civilian and military activity can always be a target. Russia means to occupy and own Ukraine after this, so that presumably they won't target nuclear power plants in a way that could make Ukraine all of a sudden not a valuable country to them anymore. So at least there's that. And also Ukraine, I believe I saw that Ukraine has cut off its links in its grid to the outside, so that they're right now relying on self-sufficient networks, which I think was done to lessen the likelihood that they could have a massive power outage because of attacks from the outside. But all of it, the whole situation is it's worrisome on every level, for sure. And again, if this gets really ugly and the Ukrainians are effective at fighting back, who knows which targets then become viable targets for Russia. One of the things that really worries me too is, what is the face-saving way out of this for Vladimir Putin? Like how, he's getting, roundly criticized. He's unified his adversaries. The NATO alliance was a little rocky there for a while, and the transatlantic relationship wasn't as warm as it has been. Now you've got like Finland talking about joining NATO. He's unified the world against him. So how does he get out of this situation without losing his position in Russia. I don't know. I don't know the way out of this. So that worries me very much. Like, if there's no way out, then what? What comes next?
Yeah. Well, let's see what we can do to mitigate that risk. It's going to be a tough one, and we need more professionals like you both in positions that can shape ideas and actions. So the last thing I wanted to bring up is, yeah, I pay attention to this whole big trends in history, and Steven Pinker keeps getting lots of book sales from this graph, which by my friends at Our World in Data, war's kind of gone away for a while. When I was, even our generation of young people now, I came of age during the Vietnam War. I didn't have to serve. I was just young enough. My brother was he just missed the draft. And there hasn't been a direct, at least United States, kind of gestalt with war other than through your TV set or for those who lost people, who were in the army. And so it'd be very easy to say, well, this is just a blip, we'll get through this and that curve is going to go down. But what it reminds me of? This is the other thing I've had Rod on here before talking about is these other curves where there's like an amnesia effect. The first one I noticed was on great earthquakes. Roger Billiam wrote a paper after the 2011 tsunami and earthquake in Japan. And he had this graph, like all the really big ones, the 9.0s, the earth-shaking, devastating earthquakes. There was a pause for about 40 years, 1964 to 2004. And what did we do in that pause? We built a shitload of mega cities, and all along the Himalayan front range, et cetera. And, we're starting to have some experience with these, with this risk again. But so I think about these disaster gaps, and, for war, I'm asking, have we just been kind of lulled? Here we have the pandemic too, which of course has the ultimate kind of sense of pauses and cataclysms. I don't know. It keeps me up a little bit at night. I'm not quite sure what we could do about it. This is what, Rod, we talked about the page 21 effect, where right. you sit there with doing your intelligence analysis work, and it goes into a briefing book. And somewhere on page 21, there's, by the way, the whole Northwest coast could go away in a tsunami or whatever, or there could be a pandemic.
Right.
So were we just kind of skating along without mega conflict? And is this just kind of, are we looking at something like that?
Well, I think certainly the nature of conflict has changed, right? Which factors into your gap, right? Mm-hmm. Because we, at least to some degree, as a planet, when we dealt with our hostilities, we moved away, at least partly, from guns and drones, or guns and tanks, to economic and informational warfare and cyber attacks. So if you included the major economic attacks and cyber attacks, your graph would look a little different. Mm-hmm. That said, I do think that we are in danger of not just I don't really like the debate about whether great power competition has returned, because I don't think very much of the 20th century maps onto this on the 21st century. I think we're in a different world. And so, but, not having the Vietnam War on TV or the Iraq War on TV, when I was in college, that was on TV every day.
Right.
We don't have the same relationship with television that we used to, but we do with Twitter, and those images are going to return, and I think it's going to have a social effect.
I had three concerns about that whole line of inquiry. One is that I think the sample size was too small. Like, you need to take a much longer look at human history and look at the history of conflict than just, the last 100 years or whatever. They tended to pick where that gap was rather than what's the whole history of humanity, which is we're a bellicose species and we go to war. It's part of who we are. So there's that. Secondly, always that saying that, conflict, there isn't conflict anymore, didn't count conflict within borders, where sometimes the nature of war hasn't changed at all and people are fighting however they can. And, that's also conflict and people pay a price, and including, Iraq, as Ron was saying, I mean, hundreds of thousands of civilians died in those wars. That was a very real war to them, right?
Exactly.
And then the third part of it that always bothered me is you're like, oh, well, we haven't had a major war. That statement only works right up until the day that it doesn't, and then you're like, oh, well, now we have one. So I always thought that was kind of ridiculous, because are you saying that, major nations would never go to war against each other ever again? And that's just not true. As we're seeing right now play out in real time, just because it didn't happen yesterday doesn't mean it's not going to happen tomorrow. So I wish it were true. I wish that we were in a post-war world where big nations that have lots of nuclear weapons at their command are not going to go to war against each other. But I don't feel at all secure in saying that that's the case. And I think we're entering a phase of our history where the risks and the dangers have gone up, and the way that we fight is shifting. As Rod said, sometimes we're going to be fighting. We already are fighting in cyber, through cyber means, through information warfare. Those things can be physically damaging too, in addition to economically damaging and everything else. So I think that those accounts were well meant, because it would be nice to be past armed conflict as a condition of humanity, but I think they were way premature.
Yeah, I think you're right.
And if I might, since one of the very first seminar I ever gave in graduate school was on a set of phenomena that operated in what's called fractal time. Earthquakes, lightning strikes, a number of natural phenomena. And if you look at the probability distribution, sorry to get all physicsy on everyone, it becomes, over a certain period of time, it becomes not just likely, it becomes highly probable that you'll have big gaps in the record of these events. And so it's the same with lightning strikes. The most probable time for a lightning strike is right after the first one, right? And so to some degree. So, and so an average distribution is among the most unlikely. So
I'll just close out here with a view of Steven Pinker's February 9th tweet. Super forecasters are saying probably two out of three odds, no Russian invasion of Ukraine in the next few months.
That was a bad call.
Good Judgment Inc. Super forecaster. Okay. Well, let's.
Yeah, I mean, as someone in the intelligence
Sorry, it's not
community,
funny. I know.
It's there are some actions that are utterly unpredictable, right? And right, even if you could get into the mindset of someone like Putin, I know the intelligence community has very difficult times predicting things like that, and so it may be unwise. But I'm glad people do it, and there's a record of it.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to say one last thing. I think one of the things that worries me most of all about all these, like, oh, war is not, we don't have wars anymore, is that not that it stopped us from investing in the means of war. We've continued to do that, but that we need to invest more in peace building, because this is what we don't want to have happen. And this is one of the things, if we let that part of our polity wither, then we don't have a way to not fight. So that's one of the consequences that worries me too about that kind of line of thinking.
Well, yeah, and that's why I'm really glad you're doing what you're doing, both of you, Sharon Burke and Rod Schoonover. Folks, when we're done, you can go back and scroll through, find their information, also on the website. And just a nod of support and gratitude for the people both in Russia, like these protesters who are working, putting their lives at risk to make a case to Putin and the powers that be there to change their course. And of course, people in Ukraine who are really on the front lines these days. Thank you both for being here today.
you.
It's an honor to be able to hold these conversations. This is Columbia Climate School Sustained webcast. Folks can look at that scrolling bar at the bottom afterwards and find ways to get in touch with me with feedback or about ideas for future shows. And let's hope we can get through this. I call them pinch points, whether in a marriage or in a community, in a country, or at the global scale. There are these points when things get aligned in ways that can go really bad or not, and finding ways to sort of recognize when you're getting into one and then finding ways out of it seems to be a critical part of what you both do. So thanks for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Thank you.
And have a good evening and work for the best. I won't say hope for the best, work for the best.